Hello? Hello? Here's a bonus for closing that large transaction. Is he your favorite?
We need the Coke.
Boy, you got a lot of demands.
That's the highlight when I go to the.
Coke and popcorn. Yeah, see everybody. Certainly.
Hi, I'm Irvine. Hi, Christine.
Oh, and Irma, this is Maya, correct?
Hi, Maya.
That's Maya. That's Christine. That's
Hi, Christine.
Oh, Maya.
I was gonna say your hand.
My hands are Maya, and I'm also Maya. Yeah.
You have 2 cups of coffee and I'm already like, oh.
You are wired, Irma.
Pleasure to meet you.
Oh, God, that's funny.
We need it.
Yes. Make sure you're to the 5G Wi-Fi. I am. I'll check. Are you? I don't know. Because otherwise it'll cut out the sound and. Yep, you are. Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. How are you today? Thanks for coming. Now, I did not give Sarah any pre or advanced notice, but Sarah, if there's anything you want to talk to us about in regards to race today, that would be very helpful.
Hey, Rich. Hey, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, I do have a quick rate update. This is based on a loan amount of 726,200 or below, 760 credit score, single family residence, and a 75% loan to value. Today, those rates would range between 5.75 to 6.25 with 0 to 1 points being charged. Same scenario, but up to 1,089,300. Those rates are ranging from 5.99 to 6.5%. And then any jumbo rates are about 6.25 to 6.625%. And then just a reminder for anyone looking at FHA loans, those FHA mortgage insurance rates did drop from 0.8 to 0.85% down to 0.5 to 0.55%. So a little bit more affordable if you have an FHA borrower.
Yeah, that's a big decrease. So the discussions in regards to individuals with credit whose credit is lower, getting a discount on the Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac fees versus those individuals with higher credit scores, that has not been implemented yet. That penalty for if you're a good borrower and you have good credit. Is that correct?
Correct. I had heard about it, but I have not seen our lenders implement it yet.
Okay. In case anyone's not aware right now, there's discussions about increasing the cost for borrowers that borrow less and have higher credit scores versus those individuals who have a higher loan to value and their credit score is much lower. So for a good borrower, what I read, it could be as much as $3,800 more to get that same loan for a good borrower. And likewise, it could be that much of a discount that you want for you. So that's being debated. Who knows? Yeah.
I don't agree with it.
I didn't think you would, Sarah. I don't agree with it either.
Yeah.
doesn't seem equitable any way whatsoever. So the moral of the story is don't pay your bills, right? And you'll get a discount.
Yeah.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate it. Any questions
welcome.
about that? Okay. So there are many form changes coming, and there's probably 60 form changes. Some are just nominal in regards to the detail of the changes. So I'm not going to go over those forms. But one of the major changes you'll see, instead of landlord, now we see rental property owner, RPO. Landlord is no longer a part of the documentation that we use provided us through zip forms. So what I've done, I've chosen what I think to be the most critical forms as to the changes, so we could go through that and have a clear understanding. And a couple of forms, I think it's going to be helpful just to go through the detail of the form itself, so you have a better understanding of how to use the form. Now, the very first form that we're going to talk about is the assignment of agreement addendum. And what's that related to? Well, in the event there's a buyer listed on the purchase contract and that buyer wishes to relinquish their interest or give their interest to another buyer. So this form would be applicable. Or what if we have 3 borrowers or buyers, excuse me, on the purchase contract, and one of them no longer wants to be a party to it? Well, we would use the assignment of agreement addendum. Does that make sense to you? So we would use this form to remove buyers. We would use this form to add buyers also. But let's just go through the detail in regards to how it's ready structured.
So Rich, are you saying that if a husband was buying a house and then they wanted to add the wife into the purchase contract later on during the transaction, this is the form they would need?
That is correct. That is correct. Or if the husband and wife, conversely, were both on the purchase contract, and the wife no longer wanted to be a party to the purchase contract, we would then use the assignment of agreement addendum. So the very first box, it's very simple, partial assignment. All we're going to be doing is adding a buyer. And the person or the assignee that we're going to be adding would be named under section 1D, assignees' names. And you're going to see this throughout the form. So the assignees' names will always be inserted under section 1D. Now we could also have a total assignment, and this is 1B, or a new buyer replaces all the buyers. So the buyer is assigning all the buyer's interest in the agreement to the assignee's name below. So under section D, we would insert the name of the assignees, or the people that are going to be the new buyers. And then section 1C, other assignments. So we're replacing a buyer and at least one original buyer remaining, or we're deleting a buyer. So if we're going to remove a buyer under section 1C, the buyer whose name we're going to be removing would be inserted in that line. So the individual who's going to be removed would be inserted in section 1C. And then once again, any assignees to whom that buyer is granting his interest to would be named in section 1D. Couple aspects of the form that are critical also. The default in the form, so if we do add or remove buyers, the default in the form is prior delivery of documents. So under section 2A1, prior documents already delivered to assignee. The assumption is when completing this form that all the past documents, the purchase contract, addenda, disclosure, so on and so forth, been provided to the assignee. That is the default. And then the requirement is to have that assignee initial the very first page of each document. And then in the event, if let's assume the buyer wants to add or remove somebody, but is not sure if the seller is going to comply, and the seller cannot reasonably withhold compliance or agreement. But if the document, we submit the assignment to the other party, to the seller, but we don't want to go through the trouble of having the potential assignee initial all documents, we would check that box. And then if we go down to section 2B, pre-qualification or pre-approval of assignee, this is important because if you're adding somebody to the transaction, and let's assume that there's a loan involved, well, what if that person you've added, the assignee, doesn't qualify for the loan? Well, it could cause a transaction to fail. So this helps prevent that, and whomever the assignee is, they have the obligation to provide the pre-approval, for example, associated with that loan. And then, of course, we have to have timeframes in which everybody must comply with returning documentation. And the presumption is under section A1 and C1 that the documents were provided to the assignee and the assignee is returning those documents with this assignment to the seller for approval. And then under section C2, if the documents, RPA, so on and so forth, were not delivered to the assignee would have 3 days after the assignment form is completed to initial and return all of the underlying documents. And then under section 1D, and this form, remember, this is a CAR form and it's not released yet, and this is wrong. But it talks about delivery and return of prior documents is not required because if assignee is buyer's own trust. Well, actually, it should be referring to paragraph 1E. So an exception in the purchase contract grants the ability for a buyer to assign their interest in the property or in that purchase contract to their own individual revocable trust, for example, or an entity that may be wholly owned by them. So that does not necessarily require the seller's approval for the assignment. We're going to do that anyways. And then section 2D, effective failure to return or attach documents. If the documents aren't returned in a timely manner, 3 days is the time frame. The seller would then have the option to negate or rescind his willingness to proceed with the assignment. And then section 3, this is nothing new, but we're going to check the box if there's any compensation paid for the assignment. Maybe there's value in this property. And so the assigned or the person granting an interest wants to be compensated for that. So we need to notify the seller in the event there is any compensation being paid to the buyer by the assignee. And then, of course, the signature page, and we can see that down here. The buyer, I think, is self-explanatory, whomever the buyer is in the original purchase contract. And then the person to whom is going to be granted the interest, the assignee, would be inserted there. And then, of course, the seller. Now, if the assignee is an entity, a corporation, LLC, so on and so forth, it's not necessary to use an RCSD, a representative capacity signature disclosure, if you complete this paragraph under entity assignee, because we're going to name the authority or the position that that person holds, granting them the ability to engage in the activity. Any questions about that? No? All right. Next on my list, buyer counteroffer, and this is a big change, but I just want to remind you of a couple of things on the buyer counteroffer, specifically section 1A. Remember, the liquidated damages and arbitration clauses are electives. So the parties don't have to agree to that. In the event not all parties to the purchase contract do not initial those areas, and it's required that all parties initial if it's going to be included in the contract, the counteroffer addresses that. So the counteroffer states if all parties have not initialed or don't specify they're including liquidated damages or the arbitration clause, then it's going to be excluded from the purchase contract. So the counteroffer addresses that. And keep in mind, it's debatable whether or not an agreement or a purchase contract is fully executed if the arbitration and liquidated damages clauses are not completed. And then other things to consider, if in the event there's a counteroffer and the purchase price is greater, then what's going to be adjusted percentage-wise would be the down payment and loan amounts. However, the initial good faith deposit nor any seller credits are adjusted on a percentage basis. And then section 1C, the appraisal gap. If you remember looking at the RPA gives the ability for a buyer to submit an offer. Let's assume it's for $1 million, but they can say in that offer, it only need appraised for $950,000. It makes their offer look stronger because it only has to appraise for $50,000 below the offer price. That difference is called the appraisal gap. So with that said, now we're countering our offer that was at $1 million, or the seller's going to counter, and we're going to increase the counter to $1.1 million. And then the buyer agrees. Well, now, based upon the appraisal gap, the appraised value only need to come in at $1,050,000 in my example. So we define the appraisal gap in here further. Any questions about that? Okay. Move this out of the way, get to my document. Not that I want to go over this form, but we'll do it anyways. Cancellation of contract, disposition of deposit, and cancellation of escrow. Somewhat self-explanatory, although the form is not necessarily. Well, first of all, if you have a client that's going to cancel, I would always ask that you contact me before we submit a cancellation. If a party wishes to cancel, they can actually cancel unilaterally. And under section 1A, we would specify whether it's the buyer or seller canceling and check the appropriate box. Then obviously, if we're going to cancel, we have to have a good faith reason. We would never give the actual details of the reason. We would specify, for example, the contingency paragraph within the RPA could be paragraphs 12 and 8, for example. Or, for example, the seller could cancel if we look at 1A2, the buyers failed to remove their contingency. So it's a valid reason for the seller to cancel, of course, but that would occur after delivering a notice to perform. So section 1 refers to, 1A refers to either party canceling unilaterally. And then section 1B, this is new to the form, there's a proposed cancellation. And the parties can agree or disagree, but after the passage of time, or 3 days, I believe, the offer to cancel will expire. But we have a couple of other things happening in here. So let's assume we want to proceed with the cancellation. In section 2C, we're going to specify the escrow number and the escrow company, assuming there is a deposit. And one good change about this form, past forms never address the escrow aspect in regards to no deposit being made, but this form does address that now. So we have choices. Section C1, seller authorizes release of buyer's deposit to buyer, less buyer's fees and costs. That's an option. So let's assume the parties agree that there's no reason to contest release of deposit. Then we would think that the seller would sign it, checking box 2C1. And then if for some reason the buyer agrees that the seller is entitled to the buyer's deposit, then section 2C2 would be checked. 2C3 allows partial release to the seller. And then 2C4, there is no deposit in escrow. So it addresses that in this form, as a matter of fact. We're not gonna have any cancellations. Yeah. It has, the cancellations have slowed down. Happy to say. And then the next phone, obviously we do a lot of leasing, and we get, actually I get a lot of questions about leasing and the Tenant Protection Act. So the notice of change in terms of tenancy, it's really a critical aspect to understand. Remember, the Tenant Protection Act is also known as AB 1482. So if there's a tenancy, and first of all, every property is subject to the Tenant Protection Act. You can take advantage of an exemption if it's available to you. So remember, it's always subject to it, but if you take the exemption and it's available to you, then you're not subject to the Tenant Protection Act. And then has some benefits for an individual who's a property owner that is not subject to the Tenant Protection Act. So common exemptions could be, it's a single family alienable unit, condo, for example, or a single family home, but that's predicated on the fact that that property is not owned by a corporation or a limited liability company in which there's a corporate member. If the property itself is 15 years of newer or newer, the property is entitled to an exemption, and it could be an Irvine company apartment building, as a matter of fact. So properties that have been completed in the last 15 years, and then also if it's a duplex, and the owner moved into one of the two units prior to the other half being tenanted, then the exemption is available. And then what is not available in terms of exemptions are triplexes and fourplexes. So the Tenant Protection Act always applies to a triplex or fourplex. There are no exemptions to that. And let's just go over a couple of things as to why this is very important. So as we complete the form, you can see in section 1, applicability of the Tenant Protection Act. All right, so one of two choices: the property or tenancy is covered by the TPA, or it is not covered by the Tenant Protection Act. So at this point in time, the changes we're talking about are going to be increasing rents. If the landlord is subject to the Tenant Protection Act, then he's limited in regards to the amount he can actually increase rent. And the limitation is actually 5% plus the cost of living index. If it's, and you can't exceed that, but in no case can the increase be more than 10%. So currently, and there's a schedule that's published, the maximum amount you can increase a rent today if you are subject to the Tenant Protection Act is 10%. Cannot exceed it. A rent increase by more than that. And then there's a formula to establish what the percentage increase is. And it's going to be based upon the lowest base rent during the past 12 months. So if I have 2 rent increases, the very first one is 5%, and in 6 more months, I want to increase it 5% again. Well, effectively, 5% of 105% exceeds 10%. So you're in excess of the 10% cap for the Tenant Protection Act. And then if we were to state that the property is not subject to the Tenant Protection Act, remember, the rent cap and just cause notification, it's very important that you complete that properly to be sure that the tenant has a document indicating that the landlord is exempt, assuming they are exempt. But the other thing that we would use to change the terms of tenancy for, once again, increasing rent. But in this specific case, we're going to make the assumption the landlord is not subject to the Tenant Protection Act. And if the rent increases 10% or less, it's only a 30-day notice. And the notice of change in terms of tenancy will satisfy the notice requirements. If it's going to be an increase of more than 10%, it is a 90-day notice. It's a long time. Then other aspects that we can complete with this form would be the security deposit if we want to increase it. Or if you notice section 4B, the rent cap and just cause addendum, if we have a month-to-month tenancy, and here's what I'm seeing a lot of. Landlords have had tenants in their properties for 5 or 7 years, and this became effective June of 2020, as a matter of fact, the Tenant Protection Act. I think it was June of 2020 or January 1st. But they've had tenants in their property for a number of years, and for the most part, new leases are never drafted. And if we draft a document today out of zip forms, all of the attached addenda are included there for us. So it's very convenient, and we're likely to not make a mistake. But I see people extending their lease just through an addendum or an amendment, and then they have never completed the rent cap and just cause form. So you have two options. When you renew a lease, I would always suggest that you create a new lease, and that way all the requirement document is attached. Now it's more work, there's no question about that. But if it's a month-to-month tenancy, you do need to give the tenant notification in terms of the rent cap and just cause form. And you can do that, and you can attach it to the change in terms of tenancy. So if, let's just say you want the tenant to just arbitrarily sign the rent cap and just cause form, they have no obligation to do that. But if you send that attached to the change in terms of tenancy, it becomes effective 30 days after delivery. Any thoughts on that? Okay. And then next, this is nothing new, the exempt seller disclosure. When would we use this form? Well, if it's a purchase contract for traditional single-family residential home, for the most part, most people, the sellers are obligated to give a TDS. And if you're obligated to give a TDS, you're obligated to provide the seller property questionnaire. That's a contractual obligation. But if for some reason the seller is exempt from providing a TDS, then they're required to give the exempt seller disclosure. So exemptions could include, let's assume, somebody that owns property, they pass on, and the decedent then inherits the property, and that individual did not occupy their property during the last year, they're exempt from providing a TDS, so that's the only need to provide the exempt seller disclosure. The form itself addresses a lot of statutorily required disclosures, so that's why we use it. Plus, it addresses our contractual obligations as a seller. And then we've been using this also for leases, but now, fortunately, CAR has taken it upon themselves to increase the obligations or disclosures that we're going to be requesting of the landlords. So pretty soon, we're going to be replacing the exempt seller disclosure, the ESD, with a rental property owner disclosure and a rental property owner questionnaire. We're going to touch upon that too. And then lease listing agreements. Let's see. Let me just move down here. And I just touched upon this on section 12B. Previously, during the leasing process, we were providing the exempt seller disclosure. Now the lease agreement indicates that the property owner, the rental property owner, is going to be presented with two documents, a rental property owner questionnaire, and that's something that's not distributed to a tenant, and then the rental property owner disclosure. The questionnaire is going to be used simply to notify you as the agent of various aspects associated with the property, help you answer questions, and also to complete the lease agreement properly. Okay. And I'm just going in alphabetical order also, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. Any questions about any of that? Yeah. And then another change, the notice to perform.
Richard, I have a question. The previous document that you showed is the listing agreement.
Yes,
right?
it is.
Okay.
I must have said lease.
Yeah, it was a lease.
It is the lease listing agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So two aspects, the RPOQ and RPOD, those two new forms are referenced in both the lease listing agreement and you'll see in the lease listing or month-to-month rental agreement. So we'll see that, but thank you for pointing that out. And then a notice to perform, it has changed. Before, if we sent out a notice to perform and we delivered it too soon, delivery was defective. So it had no bearing and the recipient had no obligation to remove those contingencies. Now, at this point in time, the language is modified such that if we deliver a notice of performance to remove contingencies, and we say all, for example, but it's really only applicable to 2 out of the 5 contingencies, they only had to remove the 2 in which the time frame is applicable to. So let's assume that I reduce my inspection contingency to 10 days, and my loan contingency remains at 17 days. And on day 8, because I could deliver a notice to perform 2 days in advance of the removal of the contingency or the scheduled removal date, I state all contingencies are to be removed. Well, it's not going to be applicable to the loan because they have no obligation to remove the loan contingency, but it would still remain applicable to the investigation contingency. Before, the entire form would just have been considered defective if you were incorrect in regards to making a demand to remove contingencies. And you did so before the scheduled time frame of the contract.
So then you would have to reissue it?
You'd have to reissue. That's correct. So I don't know if it's a bad approach to just say always remove all contingencies, and if they comply, great. If they don't, you can still cancel for those contingencies that fall within the prescribed time frame. See how that works out. And then notice of termination of tenancy. So briefly, we touched upon the Tenant Protection Act. And if a property or landlord is subject to the Tenant Protection Act, meaning the exemption is not available, they have different rules in regards to terminating a tenancy, as opposed to a landlord, a rental property owner, that is exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. So just briefly touch upon that. As you can see, 1A, there's some reciprocity here, or you can see the same language. Either the property is or is not covered by the Tenant Protection Act.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What would be an example of a landlord that would be exempt from that?
You, for example, owning a condo or a single family home. You have the ability to take advantage of the exemption. You just need to, in writing, notify the tenant of the fact that you are exempt. So the RCJC form, it addresses all this language, and there's a box that you must check. Otherwise, it's not presumed as if the tenant understands it, whether you are or not exempt.
But if the property is under an LLC, then it's not exempt.
If it's 15 years of age or newer, then the exemption's available. So if the property is 30 years old, let's assume it's a single family home, and it's owned by a corporation, the exemption is not available to them. Or if it's an LLC in which one of the members is a corporation and their property is 30 years old, the exemption is not available to them. Or also, once again, if it's a 3 or 4 unit building, the exemption is not available to them.
And what about a duplex?
Oh, what now?
A duplex.
If the owner occupies one of the 2 units prior to tenanting the second unit. So I'm the owner, I move into unit 1, I then lease out unit 2 after I moved in, then the exemption is available. But if there's a tenant in that building before I move in as the owner, the exemption is not available.
They've made it pretty complicated. It's almost like they want you to fail.
It's very complicated. And the problem becomes if there's not compliance by the tenant and you have to evict them. So if you don't do everything right, then of course the eviction could be defective and start all over, and it takes forever to get people out of these properties when they're not paying. Now, under section 2, we're going to make the presumption that the landlord is subject to the Tenant Protection Act. None of the exemptions are available. So the landlord only has 17 reasons in which they can terminate a lease if they are subject to the Tenant Protection Act. 3 or 4 are without cause, and then the remaining are for cause. So let's assume the tenant doesn't pay. So we can evict somebody based upon that, or they're damaging the property. But let's just assume I don't like the tenant and I don't want to release to them. Well, you're not in that position if the exemption is not available to you. So you must use one of the 17 reasons for terminating a lease if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act. But let's assume that you can terminate a month-to-month tenancy. Well, no matter what, you have an obligation to give a 60-day notice. Now, because the tenant's paying, they've been good in that regard. If I don't have one of the reasons listed under 2A1, then I'm going to I have to use one of those reasons, first of all, to terminate the tenancy. And when using those reasons, I have to give one of 2 things to the tenant: make the rent free for the last month, or within 15 days of the notification of termination of tenancy, write them a check for the last month's rent. And if you don't do that, the termination of tenancy is going to be defective. So if I check any of these boxes under 2A, number 1, 2, 3, or 4, assuming it's true, then you can terminate the tenancy. Now, one of the aspects is to substantially remodel the property. Well, what is that? Well, probably a property that can't be occupied or habitable for at least 30 days or more safely. That's probably considered to be a valid renovation. Replacing a carpet is not a valid reason to terminate a tenancy or to say that it's being substantially remodeled. And don't think you're smarter than them, because if they're keen to this, they're going to follow you and see what's happening with that property if it's put back on the market right away. So you should always be very sure in regards to having a valid reason when terminating a tenancy. And that's applicable to individuals that have occupied the property for 12 months or more. And then if I took advantage of the exemption from the Tenant Protection Act, I don't have to have a reason to terminate a tenancy. Remember, if it's a lease, they're entitled to the benefits of the entire lease for the duration of the lease. But if they're on a month-to-month tenancy, I don't actually have to have a reason. So that's another benefit of taking advantage of the exemption. Keep that in mind. And then if they've been in the property for more than 12 months, then it's a 60-day notice if it's a month-to-month tenancy, but the tenant only needs to give the landlord a 30-day notice. And if the tenancy has been, it's month-to-month, and it's been occupied for less than 12 months, then you need only give a 30-day notice to the tenant. And then, for example, under section C, if the property is subject to section 8 housing or the tenant is section 8, then it's a 90-day notice. Any questions about that? So the moral of the story is, don't allow your landlord to just arbitrarily increase rents by any amount they wish. There's timeframes they must meet. I haven't been involved in any litigation with individuals that have imposed rent increases beyond the maximum, for example, if they don't have the ability to do that. But it will not be beneficial. Not only that, the tenants can actually get free assistance through the housing authority.
So Rich, what's your recommendation when we lease out a property and then we're finished with the transaction, and then a year down the line, the landlord just extends it or increases the rent on their own without you? Do you just advise them at the beginning, hey, this is what you should be doing if you're going to raise rent on your own, or how do you recommend that we handle it?
That's a good question. It's a good reason for them to come back to you if you make them aware of their obligations. And I think most of the time they're just not aware. But it's just easy for them to think I'm going to save $1,500 or $3,000 leasing this place out if I just give them an extension, right? Or modify the term of the lease. And then, so I would suggest you make sure that they are aware. As you can see, in all of these forms, they're always changing, unfortunately. Just like the new rental property owner disclosure. Well, let's assume you leased the property out last year, and then you just give them an extension. Now there's more disclosures that the tenant is going to be made aware of today, as opposed to the disclosures that were required a year ago. So does that put you in an awkward position if you don't continue to stay in touch or on top of those disclosures? I don't know. It certainly can't be beneficial if they make a claim that there's hazardous material and you never gave them your proper disclosure. Or other aspects, one of the questions actually on the rental property owner disclosure questionnaire, it's one of the two. It talks about mold. Well, also, was there mold in the past? There could have been, and then maybe that's going to affect somebody's decision. So the good news is, it's like all the disclosures when selling a home, it tends to put the landlord on notice so they recall things that maybe they wouldn't normally recall. And we want to be sure that we disclose that.
So what about if they ask you to help them write up the rent increase? How do we handle that? Do we charge them a fee for it? If that's all.
I wouldn't do anything for free.
Right. But how do you suggest that we handle that? Like we just give them the form, or we're not supposed to give them the form because.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a simple answer for assisting somebody in that regard, but if we don't have an agency relationship, I guess we shouldn't be giving them any forms. They're copyrighted, first of all, and then we're not actually employed by them. We don't have a contract, but it seems like we do it anyways, right? There's the reality of it. So we may help them, but I think if we're going to help them, you better tell them their obligations, because otherwise they're going to come back to you and say, you did not disclose this information to me, and you allowed me to do something that was violating the guidelines of the law. So you bring a lot of value. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So in this section in 3A, in order to terminate a lease agreement, you need to give 60 days notice. But in order to raise the rent for less than 10%, you need 30 days notice. So let's say you give a tenant 45 days notice that you want to increase the rent, and they don't want to increase the rent. Does it mean that you cannot terminate it and it goes month to month?
Well, first of all, if it's a lease, you don't actually have to give the tenant a notice of termination of tenancy. The lease automatically terminates. Remember, you do have an obligation at least 2 weeks before the termination of the lease to give them the opportunity to do a pre-move-out inspection. But if they choose to not proceed with the terms that you have offered, then actually the lease itself, it's going to expire at whatever the termination date is, and they need to move out.
But the lease agreement, I think, maybe not in the latest one, maybe it was changed. I thought it said that after the termination date, it changes to month.
Yes, well, assuming it's going to become a month-to-month tenancy, you're correct. And that's based upon the assumption that the landlord is accepting those funds. That's what's going to create the month-to-month tenancy. Once landlords accepts payment, it becomes a month-to-month tenancy.
Okay, so you can tell them after they don't accept the new terms, which increase the rent, you can tell them then that it will not become month-to-month and not to send payment, and then you don't need the 60 days notice?
That's correct. That is
Okay.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
And then getting to her question, because it's a good point that you brought up. If it's a long-term lease, a one-year lease, for example, and you intend to increase the rent for renewal, well, even though it's not written in the statute, the guidelines are such that if you're going to increase the rent by more than 10%, you should give them a 90-day notice. So that would mean 3 months in advance of the expiration of the lease agreement, you should give them notice. And if it's 10% or less, then you should give them at least a 30-day notice. And then that's a valid reason. If the landlord is not subject to the tenant protection, the landlord is subject to the Tenant Protection Act, and the landlord provides a lease renewal on similar terms and a similar duration. If the tenant, and of course now they're incorporating the RCJC or other terms, if the tenant doesn't agree to move forward, then it's a valid reason for the landlord to terminate that living arrangement or lease, or not release the property to that same tenant.
So when we send the notice for increased lease, is it okay to just send the email or?
No, email delivery is never deemed to be a proper form of delivery. So if we look at these forms, it talks about delivery in terms of how it's becomes effective. Personal service, that is, it's always the same thing. If it's simply just a rent increase, you can mail the notice of change in terms of tenancy. First class mail, but I would suggest always sending it registered. You don't have to send a registered receipt because people are smart, they won't accept it. So if you send it registered, at least you've got validation that it was sent to them. I wouldn't send it just regular mail or first class mail. I just wouldn't find that trusting, unless they get an additional 5 days. If you do mail it, so even though the notice is 30 days, it doesn't become effective for at least 35 days because it's been sent in the mail. And then you can deliver it to their house, post it, you can do that, and mail it also. Hopefully somebody of age answers the door. But posting and mailing is probably what we see most in terms of effective delivery. And then further additions to termination of tenancies. I'm not going to repeat it. Either you are or are not subject to the Tenant Protection Act, right? So if we assume that you are subject to the Tenant Protection Act, right? Under section 2A1, this is something we just addressed. If I'm subject to it and I present you, Mr. Tenant, with a lease renewal of similar terms and a time frame, and you refuse to sign it, I don't have to allow you to remain a tenant after the expiration of your existing lease agreement. And then another reason to terminate the tenancy is section 2, because the owner has the right to enter the property for repairs, especially when they agree to it. We have tenants that refuse because why, I don't know. And then also section 1A3, non-payment. So that one's really simple, huh? And then what if you have a potential client or tenant that you've been dealing with, right? And they're making a lot of noise or a nuisance. So we give them a 3-day notice to cure. And then after that, we would give them a 3-day notice to quit. And they're still in that property, right? Yeah. And then 3 days does not include weekends and judicial holidays when you're counting. And now under the separate section, I am not subject to the Tenant Protection Act. You won't let me in. I can check box 1. And then obviously non-payment would be box 2. And then in terms of making a demand, a 3-day notice for unpaid rents, don't include the late penalties. We found ourselves revising the form based upon an attorney's direction to remove that. And then here it is, once again, it describes how service becomes effective. Any questions on that? And then the residential income purchase agreement. Let's move down. What has changed is just what you can see in red. Now, if there are units that are vacant, the contract states that they are to be delivered vacant. We wouldn't want an existing landlord leasing those properties out without us qualifying that tenant, or in addition to that, to be sure that we know what the rents are going to be. Maybe they do it for their brother or sister. So we don't want to do that. Actually, just be careful of that. And then seller occupied to be delivered vacant. Now, it sounds logical if it's seller occupied, but this is an investment property. And so that's why it's noted in here. And then you'll see one of the differences, if I can find it here. If we look at section E3 near the bottom, occupancy type, the default is an investment property, whereas in the RPA, it's a primary residence as the default. So that's why we have to specify that the seller occupied unit is going to be delivered vacant. The residential listing agreement. So a couple of things that are now listed in here that weren't. Smart home features. Do we want to include smart home features in the sale or exclude them? You should be asking your clients. And then section 10B, presentation of offers. So the default is that the broker is to present the offers as received. We're witnessing multiple offers again on properties. And of course, what happens, an agent sends their offer into the listing agent and demands that you submit my offer today, right? Then they file a complaint or they call me and they say this person's terrible, they're not doing their job. But if you check the box for 10B2, the seller is instructing you in writing to wait to present all of those offers all at one time. Now, it could be beneficial in regards to negotiating. So sometimes you might just consider checking that. You can always deliver them in advance. There's nothing that's stopping you, but you've got written instructions from the seller saying, don't give me those offers. And that way nobody could ever contest whether or not you're in compliance with with cooperation. Cooperation meaning allowing agents to show the property, present offers, so on and so forth. So that could be a strategy there. And then the residential lease or month-to-month agreement, I think it's down in section 38. So we talked about the rental property owner disclosure and the rental property owner questionnaire. So that's going to be a reference in here, but specifically, the contract states that the landlord or rental property owner will provide the rental property owner disclosure. All right, the questionnaire is not something that you must present, but it will help you, for example, answer these questions or disclosure questions under section 38 of the lease agreement. And the good news is we're almost done. Yeah. The rental property owner disclosure. This is something that the landlord is going to complete, and this is going to be provided to the tenant. And what I would do if I were anybody, remember when you're submitting a lease sometimes, well, you're really not submitting these disclosures often in advance. So that's an issue. But if you're representing the landlord, I would never suggest having the landlord sign the lease first. Always send the lease out unsigned to the tenant. All right, do that, have them sign the disclosures and attach it and send it. But you can see all the different questions now. So there's a greater amount of disclosure which I think is helpful for us. But if we look at these questions under section 9, mold, whether any elevated levels of mold were previously detected on the premises. So not just today, but in the past, if we're aware of that. So we've got
So
a number
that's
of
for,
questions.
I mean, even if it's 15 years ago,
If you're aware of it,
okay.
yeah.
And from when is this disclosure required?
This is an addendum to the residential lease or month-to-month rental agreement.
It's already required now?
It is for the new lease that's coming out in June. So the residential lease is modified to include the delivery of the rental property owner disclosure.
Okay, but the new lease agreement is already, is available?
No, it will be available next month.
Okay,
So that's what you were trying to go through it now, as a matter of fact, so you're just aware of what's taking place. And then one more rental property owner questionnaire, and this is simply for our use. But there's even more disclosure questions asked of the rental property owner or landlord. So these will replace, the good news, it'll replace the exempt seller disclosure. So now we only have 2 forms to replace 1. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. I think there's some real benefit to this though, because it we're aware and we have an obligation if there's something that could be deficient or something that's important to the tenant, make them aware. Don't put them in the property, because it'll just be a problem after the fact. Then they'll make claims and accusations, then they won't pay you, and then you just have a headache. Yes. So any questions about that? Is there something in the chat, or is it just a good morning?
Could you see me scroll up a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions. Yes, oh, yeah,
Just curious, are there generally this many changes yearly?
twice a year.
Twice.
Yeah, it's funny, as I go through these forms, I'm finding grammatical and spelling errors too. It's kind of funny. So hopefully that's corrected by the time they're actually released next month. Who's perfect, right? Nobody. Yeah, so some obviously are much more material in nature in terms of the changes. And these are material changes, I would say this time, no question about that. But the Tenant Protection Act, that is just something that is so complicated. We talk about it often because we do so many leases out of the office. And it's always difficult.
Rich, are these the only forms that have changes or?
No, there are many other forms, but in terms of the materiality to us, I would assume I made a decision to not bore you to death with everything. So many of them just have some changes in terms of terminology itself. As I mentioned, from landlord to rental property owner, that permeates all of these documents. So you'll see that as you go through that also. Okay. All right. Thank you for coming, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Woo.
yeah.
Bye.
Bye.